the folks out there already have a question. I was going to start us off with what is the worst kind of trauma responsive sermon one of us has ever preached, and an example of the best.
I'll say you're wanting us to confess our foibles.
Yes.
I didn't sign up for this.
The worst sermon I gave in response to trauma was many, many years ago. I was serving at the Church of the Redeemer in Lorain, Ohio, which is an industrial town that has seen better days. At one time, it was the fourth largest city in Ohio, but that long faded in the 60s and 70s. And I was serving a congregation that was older. It was still fairly good size. We had 150, 200 people on a Sunday, but we had a lot of people in their 80s and 90s. And one week in the winter, I did 5 funerals in 3 days.
Wow.
So I was experiencing a degree of trauma. And then on Sunday, the very next Sunday after these 5 funerals, one of our elderly members of the congregation stood up to sing the gospel hymn. And as we were marching out to sing the gospel hymn, she went down in the pew right there. And so a doctor who was in the choir and myself, we got her out into the hallway outside the church. They called 911. She woke up and she said, well, absolutely thrilled to see 2 handsome men over her as she woke up, which was really kind of bizarre. I went back into the church, went up into the pulpit to give the sermon, and the text blew out of the pulpit.
Oops.
And nothing like that ever happened again. I don't know why it happened then, but it did. And I gave some off-the-cuff extemporaneous sermon about, that bad things can happen, but God is still with us. And that's about all I could do. And it led me to a Lent, which followed right after that, where I overfunctioned for a long time because, by God, this church wasn't going to die on my watch. And when I got to Easter, I suddenly realized that I had not been doing them any favors by overfunctioning as much as I was, and I wasn't taking care of myself. My Easter sermon was lousy. And I learned a lot in that experience about admitting to your own foibles and troubles and struggles in dealing with trauma and assisting others, and out of a wealth rather than a poverty of spirit. So that's the best way I can describe it.
Thank you, Stephen. Wes may not have one, so he may not have ever done a bad sermon, so he's working on that.
I hate to admit that I've done a bad sermon. But what comes to mind, I've done plenty of bad sermons, but specifically in relation to trauma, was 25 years ago, this fall, actually. I was preaching at Gobin Memorial United Methodist Church, which was on the campus of DePaul University. I was the dean of the chapel there. And this was the Sunday after Matthew Shepard was murdered. And we had students who had been protesting at the administration building on campus with tape across their mouths because nobody had spoken up in the administration about it. So gay students and allies on campus were very much experiencing trauma. So the service on the Sunday following was, we considered a university chapel. And so I spoke about it, and I spoke about the way the church, the mainline church, our church, is guilty of this, in the sense that we have not spoken up, and we've allowed our silence, or some of our rhetoric that's not, meant to be violent, to cause trauma, to cause problems. Well, students felt very affirmed, but some in the congregation were very offended. And I thought it was actually very low key in terms of where I named our problems, but this was still 98, right? So, I mean, so I think where I failed there, or sort of failed, was I didn't help the congregation let down their defenses enough to experience the trauma and then to take some responsibility for it. So whether I could have done that, I'm not completely sure, but I am sure I didn't do enough in the early parts of the sermon to help people get there.
Thank you, Wes. Mine, like Wes's, was also some years ago, and this was more of an intramural conflict / church trauma. They were being asked to move by the city to move from their historical place into a new church. And they needed to move to a new church anyway. And I was a guest preacher. They needed to move anyway because it was no longer big enough for them. It wasn't really in great repair. It was just time to move, but they did not want to leave there. And the rector knew it. And he had been trying to work with them slowly along to get them ready for this move. And they viewed him as simply caving to the desires of the municipality. Rather than, we're growing as you all wanted. You all asked for us to grow. We now need new facilities. We need to, and the place where we're going is going to be more accessible to more people. It's going to be in a place that's easier to get to, and this place simply won't be available to us any longer. Well, knowing all that, instead of actively addressing it at that moment, I decided, and I was fairly new as a preacher, that today was the good day to try my hand at preaching from notes for the first time ever. Yeah, first mistake. Second mistake was I hadn't practiced delivering it. Third mistake was I did acknowledge in passing the conflict at the church, but I kind of made it ease into the saints' day. So I gave it the weight of what I had to say about it did not match the weight of what the congregation was feeling. And then on top of that, my fourth and the icing on the cake mistake was, blessed Jesus, I dropped my cards. The cards on which I had yeah. And so after I hurriedly scooped them back up, not in order, I was completely, it was over. It was so bad that the rector had to get up and finish the sermon. I was absolutely of no use whatsoever. And so that is a story that you can keep in your hearts, and know that whatever you do in the future, preaching on trauma to your churches, you cannot do worse. It will not be worse than that. No, I see you, Bonnie. It won't. It won't be. All right. And so now that we've kind of done the warm up, well, half the warm up, what's the best sermon? This is to the panel. What's the best sermon that you have preached in response to trauma, in your humble opinion?
I'll go ahead, because it was not long after I learned my lessons from the first one. First stuff that was so bad. It was in the same place in Lorraine. The lesson was where Joseph forgave his brothers when they were all in Egypt together. And I was moved by this lesson in many ways, and read a lot about forgiveness and reconciliation as I was preparing the sermon. And one of the things I realized is that how different forgiveness and reconciliation are. Forgiveness is about our emotions in relationship to those who harmed us. And when we forgive, it's not because we're going to let the other person off the hook, but to let go of our resentment and anger and pain and the way we've been destroying ourselves in response to the harm that someone's done to us. Whereas reconciliation is the idea of getting back in relationship with each other, which is not always a good idea. I mean, as I was preparing this sermon, it dawned on me that what makes Joseph's forgiveness and reconciliation with his brothers so powerful is because Joseph is powerful. He can no longer be abused by his brothers. As a matter of fact, he can abuse them because he's number 2 in Egypt. But the power differential has changed. And I was realizing it's not wise for people to be reconciled when the power differential is still against those of us who have been hurt. And so I got up in church and I preached that. And I also said, I know that the church sometimes has pushed people to forgive and reconcile far too quickly. And for that, I apologize on behalf of the church. We were wrong. And I said it that directly and that plainly. I did not expect what happened afterwards to happen, but it did. Within 10 days, I was called by 4 people who had been horribly abused as children, who all said, how do you do that? And I said, I don't know. I think I need to talk with somebody in the mental health community and ask about that. And maybe what we need to do is set up a support group for people who can talk about this, talk about the relationship between forgiveness and reconciliation and how we do this in a healthy manner. And one of the people who came to me, heard me say that, was involved in community mental health. She put together the support group and it took off. And it was an opportunity for people to deal with past trauma that was still real in their lives, very real, and ways to deal with it, ways to move forward. And I was quite surprised by what happened. I didn't expect it. I just was trying to be true to what I thought the text was telling us. And that has been a benchmark for when I look at trauma in the church or the community, is how can I do what I did that Sunday? How can I recognize what's really going on and speak the truth in love, be willing to apologize on behalf of the church where we get it wrong, and move forward in ways that comfort people. So a little bit of my story.
Thank you, Stephen. Wes, we think you're talking, but we're not sure.
Thank you. Yeah, mine, the one that came to mind anyway, I guess maybe in relation to my first story, though, was a funeral I did for a seminary student at my last school. She had suffered from Marfan syndrome her whole life. And she came to seminary having, illness and struggled with it and in and out of the hospital some, and wasn't sure what she wanted to do. This was a Disciples of Christ school, so very low church kind of situation. But she sort of found her voice in seminary. She really grew. She was one of those traditional college-age students who goes right to seminary. And she thought she couldn't preach because she was a woman. She'd grown up in a household that had said that and all. And I remember in Intro to Preaching, which I taught her, she did her first sermon scared to death, and then she was excited to do her second sermon. That kind of, so it was just lovely. And while she was there, even though she came from a very evangelical family, she came out of the closet to herself and to others, and she got into a relationship. And then right after seminary, in that tradition, you can be ordained immediately. She was ordained and then she died. And everybody felt the great tragedy of that, of a potential of a life that was cut short, potential of vocation cut short. And I didn't do anything amazingly profound, but there were two things I thought I did that were very helpful. One is there were still people in her extended family that did not know she was gay, and the family didn't want her to, and she would not have wanted to come out at her funeral. And yet there were friends and family and friends and her partner who needed that named. So I met with them in advance and I said, here's our code language. When I talk about this, you know, I'm talking about this side of Brooke was her name, and others will hear it differently, but you know, this is what I'm talking about. So I did that part, and I think that helped bring some healing in the midst of a funeral service that was not very healing in other ways. And the second thing I did was I just found a way to name the very fact that she was ordained as a fulfillment of her vocation and a witness to us all. And that, for her family and the people she went to seminary with, allowed sort of that sense of loss of what could have been to be at least a small celebration of what was. So it didn't, you know, of course, funerals don't fix grief. They just name it as a stopping point and hope to move on. But I think that was a good moment of sort of at least naming the trauma and giving a little bit of a different perspective on it for that moment.
Thank you, Wes. I think my best sermon in response to trauma, and this is just in general, it doesn't have to be anything that and for me. My best sermons are when the sermon is only part of the response to the trauma. The trauma is in the prayers. The trauma is followed up with a some kind of either another service for grieving or litany and lament, and also some follow-up with individuals who need that follow-up along the way, and also referrals for those who need other kinds of help in that trauma. About 4 months after I got to a new parish, one of our parishioners was shot to death by the police. Yeah. And what you might think what's often in the news, the racial balance was reversed. The victim was a white woman. The officer was a black man. And for a couple of weeks, they couldn't do details until they had done an autopsy. And so for 2 weeks, the church is kind of sitting in that tension. And so I did that sermon, that first Sunday and the second Sunday were connected. It was a series of grief in the face of the unthinkable. And the lections, I don't remember what they were now, but it was Old Testament, and they went in perfectly because you can barely breathe on an Old Testament story or a Hebrew Testament story that doesn't have some kind of grief and lament and horror in it. And at the end of that series, come to find out that the police officer did, and the body cam was released, that our parishioner had committed suicide by cop. And so that was then we had to do another thing on suicide for a while. And I know that's not one sermon in response, but again, I think my best response to that kind of in your face, visceral trauma in a congregation requires more than one sermon. It requires a kind of multi-pronged approach of the prayers and newsletter articles and the ability of people to come together and just talk with coffee and conversation, and then close that with compliment. We did that for a couple of weeks as well, so that folks could just be open, ask their questions, and because our congregation was both red and blue, there were some preconceptions on each of those political viewpoints about what must have happened. And so getting to talk through that as a church family as a whole, rather than this side against this side, was also very healing. All right. So students and attendees, I have done the warm-up questions. It is now on you. And I will let you know that as a social worker, I am very comfortable both sitting in silence and waiting and voluntolding people. So here we go.
Okay, I will start this. So you reminded me of some of the things that have happened over the years to me, because I kind of tend to stay in the moment and then move forward. But looking back, sometimes it's not the words that you preach. Sometimes it's the fact that you actually showed up in whatever weird situation you were asked to witness to God. I was a hospice chaplain for a lady who was Catholic. And I'm one of those people who can do healing hands. And so she ended up talking to me over a period of a year. Little beknownst to me, she set me up. This was her final thing, her final shtick to the church, by telling them that Reverend Dr. Williams would be doing the sermon to a Catholic priest. Didn't say I was a woman, to a very conservative traditional church. And when I walked in with my robes and they looked at me and they're like, so who are you serving? Who are you waiting for? And I was like, it's me. Well, they wouldn't let me in the sacristy to dress. They told me where I could not walk, where I could not touch. And I was like, oh, I see what's going on. And I got up there and preached like these were my family members. And women in the congregation were standing up and going, yeah, that was Joan. That was Joan. You knew her. It upset the priest that at some point in the funeral, he handed me the thurible. Like, okay, you're a priest. You should know what to do. And I did, thank God. And I finished the service and everything was fine. And the trauma from losing this matriarch of the church and having her represented in the pulpit by a woman, which totally took me off guard, was more healing than anything I probably said. But I will say I wanted to run out of there screaming several times. And so sometimes the reaction to the trauma is to just suit up and show up. Even when it's uncomfortable, knowing that your presence there is doing something more than you know. And we're in a world right now where I think we're going to be asked to suit up and show up in very uncomfortable positions. So just throwing that out there, sometimes it isn't the words, sometimes it's your willingness. And I know we've all been there, right? So just a reminder. Thanks.
Thank you, Lois. Do we have any questions for Bonnie? I see Bonnie and Nancy. Bonnie, I saw first, so Bonnie and then Nancy.
No, I was just gonna say, that was incredibly brave. Just to even stay there, much less to do all this stuff.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yes, Nancy.
So recently we've been, as many of you have been planning ahead. And so I've been thinking about our annual Blue Christmas service, which has become very well received. And listening to the examples that you all gave this morning, it occurs to me to wonder, are there other times in the year, given all that our world has been through in recent times, where additional opportunities for that kind of communal grieving and remembering and honoring might be called for? And I wondered if you have anyone, or especially the panel members, have ideas about other times that might serve a similar purpose, rather than that just that kind of that one time of the year. It seems to me like there needs to be something more opportunities for people, because not everybody is going to respond to that particular one.
I see you, Lois, and
Yeah.
yeah.
So
I know for me,
All Souls and Good Friday, end up being basically a community memorial at our church. We're recognizing the souls that have gone before, and the same thing with Good Friday along with Jesus.
and also in light of how fractious our divisions are now, I'm one of those that doesn't think the country is any more divided than it ever was because of where I stand on social location. The 50s and 60s weren't fun for anybody who was any darker than a piece of paper. And it was that fractiousness played itself out on TV between those who were segregationists and those who were, there were three factions actually, those who were segregationists out loud and proud, those who were segregationists quietly, but we don't be actually mean to anybody who's darker than a piece of paper. And then those who were for real and for true, no equality for everybody. This is not Jesus to do this thing. And so looking back on that kind of political history, this is bad, but it ain't the first time we've been here. And it won't be the last time we're here. But given that, for a lot of people in their lifetimes, in a way that they're able to notice, it's the worst it's been. It's been a thing to have coffee and conversation in Compline the day after voting. Just because there's winners, there's a huge in the perception of the larger community now, there's going to be huge winners and huge losers, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And so somebody's grieving, somebody's celebrating, and the way to get part of the way to make space for both of those, for me, has been to have that coffee and conversation, and to get back to the idea that in this space, we are one church family. We're not who we voted for. We're not our socioeconomic ideals. We are the family of God. Veronica has her hand up.
Yes, Nikki. I'm wondering if you could say a little more about how you structure that conversation, because I've done conversation in Compline, and we did that during the early days of the COVID pandemic. And it became a really good touchstone for people who wanted to really get together and talk. We did that on Zoom, and then, I haven't done that again since being able to be in person. And I wonder about setting it up in a way that it actually does bring about unity, as opposed to people just sort of not knowing what to do.
Right. So when the coffee and conversation is first, and we close with Compline. So we're closing it. Jesus has the last word. And we start out with some community norms. This is how we will address each other, and we agree on them as a whole. Let's come. Hey, we're here tonight, and we do it every time, even though we end up usually with the same norms. But we're here tonight to speak to one another as siblings in Christ. How can we do that respectfully, as seen by the baptismal covenant, which said we will honor and uphold the dignity of all human beings, regardless of who we voted for. And so what are the norms? We want to say, you know, everything's confidential. We will we'll use I statements, all those things. We come up with about 6. And we put them up on a little white, because folks get to write, and we have people, I'm not up there standing for, we call somebody up to write them up as we think of them. We spend about 15 minutes on that. We open in prayer. We have coffee and conversation, and usually something really sweet and high caloric, with some fruit or something, some you know, crudité vegetables for those who don't want to go that route. And then usually, because we've set the rules out in the beginning, and the folks, and to come out usually, that to actually have to show up often cuts out the people who aren't there in good faith, who just want to either crow or bitch. Excuse my language. Jesus cussed. At least last I checked, that when he called the Syrophoenician woman a little dog, I don't think he used little dog. Sylvia may know different than me. Sylvia, if you do, speak up. And by that time, only the people who are speaking in good faith. We've had some coffee. We've had our little opening, you know, good to see you. How's the weather? You know, my kid's sick. My dog has to wear that cone of shame. And we can get into, and then I will start it off with an icebreaker or we already know each other. So I started off with a general question that I think all the people might have, and then I will open it up. And within about 10 minutes, folks get really, at least these folks get really, really vulnerable, because they feel like it's a safe space. And we just honestly talk without going at each other. Now, I did have to do some pre-work when I got here, because we had more blues than reds, and they were bullying the red folk. There were, and not just and we had to talk about what the bumper stickers in our parking lot said to somebody who didn't agree with those. We had to talk about the things that were on our poster board, that used to be on our poster board, because I took them all down as soon as I got there, that intimated that red voters were stupid, or red voters were evil, and that blue voters were good. All those left. And so it took a minute. It took about 6 months for it to get to where we could have those kind of discussions, where people could trust one another. But that's kind of the outline of how we did that. Wes or Stephen, anything you want to add to?
Yeah, I'll add that, you know, in addition to thinking about liturgical moments, you know, the Methodist in me wants to go to Scripture. So, you know, as I talked about yesterday, almost all texts can be read in light of trauma, conflict in the background. And we often think our preaching choices are from the Old Testament, the epistle, or the gospel reading. But the psalm, of course, those laments show up regularly in our readings. And I would suggest preaching on the lament psalms, teaching the people about the lament form, so that can become part of their prayer practice. So bringing that into the core of the sermon and into the rest of worship would be a really good way of finding regular times to name trauma, even broadly, if it's not in response to a very specific trauma, but bring it in regularly so that people are invited to see the connection between the gospel and trauma.
Mm-hmm. If I may add on to that, because I've been sitting here thinking about those occasions when we can use maybe something that is common to Christian tradition and build upon it as an opportunity to work through and allow scripture and prayer to address trauma. There's the Week of Christian Unity that happens every January, which gives people every day a set of scriptures and prayers to pray that we can use to remember, reflect upon, process a particular tragedy or trauma that has occurred or is occurring to us as people of faith and of God. There's the National Day of Prayer that I think is in May. This is usually always right around my birthday, but it's and it's another occasion, right, where it's maybe not so much an Episcopal tradition, but it's just another occasion where we can co-opt time that's been set aside for prayer and make that part of our processing within the communities that we serve of different trauma that is occurring. And then I've learned in my community that I serve, because some of them are from African nations, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, that there are practices in those communities that involve remembrance of people who have died or people who have suffered or tragedies, 100 days after, a year after. It's kind of built into the cycle of life and death for these communities or individuals from these countries. And so it's become part of our overall congregational life. Like, we know to anticipate and expect. And that could also be a place where, if somebody has gone through a traumatic experience or the community has gone through a traumatic experience. And then the last thing that I will name is I personally love doing vigils. So when something happens that can bring in, that impacts a community, the Commonwealth of Virginia, not just Trinity Church in that corner of Arlington, you can get some collaboration going. You can get people there that are helping to form and shape an environment where we know that we're in trauma and we're going to do something about it. We're going to name it. We're going to share it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to pray about it. So those are the examples and suggestions that I would make that build upon some pre-existing ways of remembrance and reflection, healing for people through traumatic situations.
Thank you, Mother Kim. That's perfect. Yes, Lois.
So during COVID, I'm not a cradle Episcopalian. I am still learning to love Compline. And this is one resource that will break open your congregation. We did a book discussion on prayer in the night for those who work or watch or weep. And it is by Reverend Tish Harrison Warren. And she is a young reverend when she writes this, or she's in childbearing years, and she goes through a miscarriage. She tells her story through serving through Compline in this book. And for my cradle Episcopalians, this broke them open. And it also allowed me to just record a Compline. And I found out that they were viewing this. One lady said, you know what? I just push the little button on my phone and I go to sleep to you doing Compline. And this is how we got through the pandemic. So if you're doing a Bible study, if you want to get your Episcopalians into their prayer book, I really do recommend this prayer for night for those who work or watch or weep. You will cry through the book with her, and you will pray through with her. So,
Lois, that sounds great. Can you put that in the chat, that source in the chat for us? Bless you.
And one more we haven't talked about yet, Nikki, is healing services.
Yes.
You can schedule those for whenever, and they can be also just a cyclical, regular part of the life of your community.
What services? I didn't hear that.
Healing services.
Oh, healing service. Yeah.
Yeah, I know we just in Montana did one for a church that had sadly fallen into this pattern of living in the veneer. And it was a congregation full of trauma and full of pain, but it wasn't talked about, it wasn't acknowledged. And we organized a healing service and spent the 3 weeks before that inviting people to offer names that they would like to be prayed for. People who had died, people who were grieving, people who were sick, people who were suffering. We ended up with 400 names. And of the congregation of 120 or 30, about 30 people came. The rest didn't have the courage to come yet, but everyone knew the names of their loved ones had been read.
It's wonderful. Thank you, Sylvia. And thank you, Veronica, for that great question. And thank you, Lois, for putting that in the chat, that source in the chat for us.
In the
Next
midst of
question.
trauma, I would also encourage us to keep in mind interfaith opportunities to deal with that. In the early 2000s, I became close friends with an evangelical pastor, believe it or not. We didn't agree on a whole heck of a lot, but what we agreed on was sitting down with the leaders of the local mosque. And it turned into first an observance of the 5th anniversary of 9/11, and then the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and then the creation of an interfaith group to support one another as we move into, how would we put it, this increasingly secularized world where the forces of religion are pushed to the side. And we felt we still had something to say about unity, about hope, and about the willingness to work together even in the midst of trauma. So.
Nikki, I would add that to our conversation that apart from preaching on trauma, we all need to be preaching on theodicy in general, and that will inform conversations later about trauma. You know, the emergency room's never the time to have a theodicy conversation. So it needs to be happening regularly in the pulpit from different angles. Doesn't mean your answer has to be the end-all answer. After all, Western Christendom has been dealing with this for the whole time we've been around. But your people need to know that you have some kind of answer. So the flip side of what Lois was saying just a bit ago about, you know, showing up, which I think is exactly right, is sometimes a ministry of presence is not enough. A word is needed. And so if you have said your words about theodicy repeatedly at different times, then in a funeral that's tragic or whatever situation, you can echo those words without teaching them anew in a way that people find some comfort in your understanding of how God is just and merciful in relation to the question of suffering.
Amen. And also for those of us who have any, you know, if this is your second career or for whatever reason, for whatever horrible reason, you've had to really brush up on your theodicy and your trauma knowledge. Putting that, kind of balancing, having a rhythm, so that who talked about the tic-tac-toe board with the, was that Christine, about having a friend who had the people in her tic-tac-toe board? Well, do you do the same thing for types of sermons? You can do the same sort of thing. So this is especially if there's nothing particularly going on within that community. So this is the Sunday I lean on regular lament, just so that my people have the skill of lament when something horrible happens. This is the Sunday that I lean on joy in all circumstances. This is the Sunday that I lean on. This is the Sunday that I lean on the faithful discipleship. This is the Sunday that I lean on, so that we're, as a former social worker, I have a tendency to see everything in terms of lament and everything in terms of trauma and everything in terms, and so that schedule keeps me from having. Yep, here comes Mother Nikki. She gonna talk to us about sadness. We're gonna be sad when we leave. And so that way, our folks, especially if you're in a ministry context where you get to have a long relationship, years long relationship with your people, if you're able to give them, as Wes was saying, and as Lois was saying, and as Stephen was saying, and Sylvia was saying, a vocabulary to name God in all the situations, then when something horrible or greatly joyful or greatly boring or greatly whatever happens, they've already got the foundations to hear whatever additional you have to say, whatever weight more that is more weighty you have to say, because this situation is now more weighty. You can't preach justice every Sunday. You can't preach lament every Sunday. You can't preach trauma every Sunday. And most of us know that by now. But there's a way to, the only way that I'm able to do it in a regular basis, so that I'm not leaning somewhere one way or the other because of where I'm at or because of what's easy for me, is to have a schedule.
Can I ask you something about what you just said about, I love that idea of really intentionally planning to change things up every now and then. Thankfully, COVID took care of that for me. And I'm in a new place. But you said something about the skill of lament.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit more about what that, I mean, I understand it as a practice, but how would you frame it as a skill?
I'm speaking strictly from a majority culture US, we don't have the skill of lament because there's so much that we deny. We deny death. We deny age. We deny difficulty in general. It's a pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you work hard enough, everything's going to go great. And if it's not going great, it's because you didn't have enough faith, or you didn't have enough know-how, or you didn't have enough you didn't have the right gender, sexuality, whatever. You had too much sin. And so the skill of lament involves the skill of empathy. You can't let yourself be open and vulnerable in that space if you don't have self-compassion. And if you don't have self-compassion, you can't have empathy. And one of the ways that we as Christians, especially in the US, only in my experience, is to begin to open ourselves up to that kind of self-compassion, is to realize how much God loves us when we're fucking it up. Which again, almost every story in both testaments has people fucking it up. And God's like, yep, still here. I still know you. I still love you. There might be consequences to what happened, but I still love you. And I get it. I get why you did what you did. And I'm here with you in it. And we still gonna walk through this consequence. And so that kind of the skill of vulnerability is a skill. Being able to open up is a skill. Being able to not deny is a skill. Being able to be self-compassionate is a skill. And the larger culture and the systems in it work every day to make sure we don't use those. And again, not that our culture is particularly sinful. Our culture, just like every other culture and every other empire and every other pharaohship or what have you, the enemy is busy using whatever we've got to make sure that we are isolated, uninformed, and completely despairing. So either we have no hope, so we're either living in the veneer and taught, and that's the way we're supposed to be living, in the veneer, as Sylvia said, or we're so deep in despair that we can't see our way out. There is my mini sermon.
I think that this telling the whole salvation story in preaching helps with that. It does what Nikki is talking about. Like if I just don't deny all the crazy stuff that's in the Old Testament. And I'm saying Old Testament because that's how people in my church think of it. They think of it as the old news, not the good news. And so I have to have conversations with people about why we even read it in church and what it's for. And for me, it is for helping people understand that God's love is forever, even with all of this. And that, that's my favorite funeral sermon, of course, is God's love is forever, because that's the hope of the resurrection. So I get really excited about this. I think that there's a good thing about planning. So you can plan to make sure that you go through as much of the salvation story as you can throughout the year. And the lectionary does that. So I find it very helpful when I'm thinking about it, is to kind of zoom out and think, how does this fit in the whole story of God's people and God's relationship with them? Because I have a lot of people who would just chuck the Old Testament as they hear it, as old news, and just only talk about Jesus. And of course, we all know that you can't talk about Jesus without inhabiting the Hebrew scriptures. So
right.
That I think is a great thing when thinking about preaching specifically. Liturgical stuff I find very helpful too, but I think the preaching part for me is like, as long as we're telling the whole story, we're going to get it trauma sometimes.
Yes. And we're going to get it joy, and we're going to get
at hope and joy too.
Well, y'all, we've got 4 minutes, so time for one last question. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank y'all so much. One last question. Nah. Going once, going twice. Sold. All right. We will break. We will not return until was it 2 p.m. Eastern? Is that right? Yes. 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, 11 a.m. Pacific.